On the gavel, let's go.
The meeting of the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Association is now open.
Are we on, Chris?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Need a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved. I'll second it.
Been moved and seconded. Those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. We'll turn to item number 2, which is public comment on matters not on the agenda. And there are cards to be filled out if you have questions that you want to present to the board and that sort of thing. But I want to make a couple of other comments here. There is a timer right over here, a 3-minute timer, and we're going to exercise that 3-minute timer. See, please make your comments to the board, not to the staff people, but to the board. Once you have completed your presentation, which should be directed directly to the board, we ask that you return to your seat and you not return to the podium on that agenda item in the future, today. Okay. And for people that have an anxiety about talking to a microphone or to a board or something of this nature, you can fill out the form. If you have questions, you can mail them in to the staff, or you can call them. If you call the staff, they will get you an answer, and if they can't answer it directly, they'll get you a letter back telling you what the answer is. We want everybody to be as informed as possible. I think that just about covers everything. But when you go up to there, be sure and identify yourself with your name and whatnot, so that if the staff can listen to what you have to say, and they may have an answer to you, and if they do, they will send you a letter telling you about it. I only have one request. I assume there's more than one request. The first person is Buck Rogers. Buck. Okay.
Just one thing I'd like to stress is the whole project needs to be about flood control only, not about picking up habitat and all this. One other thing, where there's a will, there's a way. So you guys need to push the will, and Michael Bassett and his team will figure out a way to work on that levee without taking all of the homes out there. So that's all I'd like to say.
Thank you very much, Buck. There being no other requests to speak, then the approval of the minutes for December the 8th, 2011.
Move approval.
Been moved. Have a second?
I second.
Been moved and seconded. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. Item number 4, review of the monthly year-to-date revenue and expense forms.
Good morning, board members. This report is for the month of November, and the cash side of the cash flow had $5.6 million coming into the account for the month of November, and this represents the state's ongoing participation in the design and construction of the levee projects we have going in West Sacramento. Total expenditures for the month of November were 6.3. The total year-to-date is has been a cash balance of $29.5 million and expenditures of $16 million. And it's been pretty, our cash balance has maintained a pretty even flow throughout the projects. We expect to see some more heavy expenditures in December, and the rivers and the CHP projects will probably wind down then, and the Southport project will start to emerge as the primary project activity. We expect to return to the board next month to present and request approval of the financial statements for the previous fiscal year 2010-11, and that'll be for the February meeting. And that concludes the report.
Any questions? No. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Item number 5, the West Sacramento Area Flood Control Association project update.
Okay, well, good morning, board, and Happy New Year. I wanted to start off today's presentation with a video that was produced by the Army Corps that I found it gives a really good idea of our project, how we're moving forward, some of the project components that we're looking at, and some of the projects we just completed, and in our Southport EIP project. So if you could run the video, Chris.
An extensive inspection of California's levees raising questions tonight about the standard of maintenance of the levees across our area.
There's a concern of under seepage through sandy materials under the levee.
Sacramento is the most at-risk metropolitan area for flooding.
Yeah, it is going, and look at the water just raging, and that is heading towards homes.
Across the nation, man-made mounds of dirt or concrete, commonly called levees, surround waterways, farmland, and cities, helping control the flow of water and reduce the risk of flooding for millions of people. In California's Central Valley, there are as many as 6,500 miles of levees. Levees are an extremely important part of the region's flood risk reduction system, but like all infrastructure, without continual inspection and maintenance, they are guaranteed to fail.
There are 4 primary reasons why levees fail. They include seepage, stability, erosion, and height. A seepage levee failure involves water literally seeping through the levee or the levee foundation. A stability failure involves a section of levee sloughing off because of water up against the levee. There are numerous types of erosion failures, but what's prevalent on the Sacramento River flood control system is toe erosion steepening the slope such that it's unstable to the point of collapse and inundation. And then there's levee height. When you get more flow than what they're designed for, oftentimes leads to a levee failure because of water spilling over the top of the levee.
Many California levees were constructed more than 100 years ago, often by non-engineers simply piling up dirt along a riverbank or around an area of land to stop floodwaters. Over time, without proper maintenance and improvements, and because of impacts from weather, animals, and unauthorized development, these levees became weaker and weaker. As more and more people move into the floodplains behind those levees, the risk of catastrophic flooding continues to increase.
So what do we do to fix levees to deal with those various problems? For seepage, a common fix is building a seepage cutoff wall.
A seepage cutoff wall is constructed by digging a deep trench into the middle of the levee and filling the gap with an almost watertight wall of clay or concrete.
Cutoff walls can only be constructed to about 120 feet deep, and if you're not able to tie into an impermeable layer at that depth, then we have to use a different method, and what's frequently used is a seepage berm. The intent is to extend the seepage path long enough so that the velocity of the water that's coming out is so reduced that it doesn't weaken the levee and levee foundation. Stability is dealt with by widening a levee and flattening the slopes.
Erosion is dealt with by building a layer of rock to strengthen the levee and its foundation. For height deficiencies, we construct levees higher or build a flood wall. Even after levees are improved, there will always be risk. That's why continual inspection and maintenance is required. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers sets the safety standards for levees under its authority. Local and state agencies own and maintain the levees. To find out more about levee projects in California's Central Valley, visit these federal and state websites.
I found that video quite compelling. It tells the story about what we're doing on our project. And I thought the graphics were very good to help the public and the board and everybody who's watching it understand what we're talking about in a little bit greater detail. And we're going to post that video on our website so that others can come and take a look at that video in the future. If you could put the PowerPoint up, please. So what I wanted to talk about today, I'm going to give you a little bit of projects update of our program, and then we'll launch into the Southport EIP project. And I need the Okay. So I have some good news to report. 2011 was a very good year for the program. We got a lot of projects completed, a lot of money spent into the ground, improving levees, so we'll talk about that. Some good news on the funding front. As Mark went over the numbers, things are looking pretty well from a financial standpoint for the district. We got our design funding agreement amendment approved by the Department of Water Resources. It's a substantial increase to our design funding agreement. It was a $14.3 million increase. So that's a substantial amount of money, and it's a substantial commitment by the Department of Water Resources to our program. It's already been signed by some of the state people. It's gone through our signatures, and it's back with the state for final processing. So we're very excited to report that. The increase of that design funding agreement is twofold. It's because we achieved the 90% cost share for the 3 EIP projects in the north, the I Street Bridge, CHP Academy, and the rivers. So we were able to increase the cost share of the design funding agreement. As I've told this board repeatedly, once we nailed down the cost share in the construction funding agreement, we go back and true up the design funding agreement. So we were able to incorporate those costs. And then also that because of that higher increased cost share, we're able to move more money to Southport to be able to build more levees under the EIP program. So the state, working with our team, was able to increase the size of that design funding agreement. So it's very good news. So I'm pleased to report that to the board today. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is out by DWR for public review. It's going to be presented to the Central Valley Flood Protection Board this month. I'll be attending that meeting. So that process is moving forward. They were under a mandate, SB 5, to submit that report, get it approved by the middle of this year by the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. So they're on track to do that. So we're part of that process, keeping our interests in mind. So we're very engaged in that process. The GRR, the General Reevaluation Report that we're working on, both with the state and the Corps, we've had some issues with that study, as I've reported to the board. The Army Corps Headquarters had questions on the F3 document. That document is the existing conditions report document for our study. And the district was not able to release the nature of those questions or the actual questions to us. They were able to talk about it in a little bit of not very much detail. So we weren't very happy with that. We're a partner in this study, us and the state. So we were not at the liberty to receive those questions. So we attended the project review board on Tuesday at the Army Corps. We had good representation from the state at that meeting. Ken Ruzich was there, Bill Panos, and I. So we made our thoughts be known, that we let them know that we need to be a part of that process. We need to be engaged in everything that's going on in this study. We're a funding partner. We're contributing a lot of the information to this process. So the district staff, they understand that, and they're working hard on our behalf to try to get us those comments, and we expect them any day now. So it was a positive meeting. We hadn't been into PRB in a while. As Ken noted, he says, I think we got to get in there more often, and we're going to do that. So it was a very positive meeting. So we'll see what comes out of that, and I'll keep the board apprised of that. But we do expect the F3 conference to happen within the next several months. We expect all the questions that they asked to be answered in that conference. Just to give you a general sense of what those questions were, as best we understand them, it was, headquarters was asking, how does the West Sacramento GRR fit into a system-wide analysis? So they wanted to know, from a regional perspective, are our levee improvements that will be proposed under our document, does that fit into the regional plan? And a lot of that's addressed in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, which I just talked about. A key component of the state's plan is to protect the urban areas first, at the same time looking at other regional projects that would benefit the entire region, but not to slow down on levee improvements to protect our cities and where the majority of the peoples live. So that's a key component, and we're letting the Corps know that we need to keep progress moving. We can't slow down to think about, other regional interests. We just need to keep moving forward, but at the same time looking at ways to benefit the entire region. That was one of the comments. The other one was on EO 11988, Executive Order 11988, which just talks about building within floodplains. We thought that we had put that issue to rest earlier. The mayor's been very engaged on this item in the Conference of Mayors through that avenue. So we're going to be able to supply a lot of information to address that question. So that's kind of the nature of what's going on. It wasn't real specific questions about our system. It was more on a regional basis. So we'll take care of those issues. I wanted to let the board know that Bill Panos, our Public Works Director, and Mayor Cabalden will be going to Washington, D.C. next week. They have a couple of key issues that they're going to be representing this board upon in the city of West Sacramento. One is our federal appropriations to keep our GRR process moving forward. Our request this year is $1.4 million to keep the study moving forward. So that is one item. The key item that they'll be focusing in on is the whole federal crediting issue, the 104 to 221 issue. That item is key to our progress to move forward on a bunch of different ways, most notably just building our EIP projects and getting federal credit so that we don't get slowed down. So that's one of the key items. They have meetings set up, just to let the board know. Some of the key meetings are with the Senate Energy and Water Appropriations Committee, Corps Headquarters, the Assistant Secretary of the Army staff, Senator Boxer and Feinstein staff, and FEMA Headquarters. So we have a lot of key meetings set up in a short amount of time, so they're going to be very busy next week. Bill's going to come to next month's meeting to give you guys an idea of how those meetings went. So I'll have him do a little report before the board next month. On FEMA remapping, FEMA has issued their guidance for modeling floodplains behind levees that do not meet the 100-year certification. So we're reviewing those guidelines now. We have MBK engineers doing a very detailed review on our behalf. We'll be providing comments at the end of this month back to FEMA to deliver our comments to their study. I'm about a third of the way through. I'm not getting the sense that we're really affected positively or negatively in what they're proposing based on the nature of our system, but I'm going to let the hydraulic experts finish their review, and then we'll provide those comments to the board next month so you can get an idea of where we stand on FEMA's revised guidelines. I'm going to try to find out from Region 9 staff is, okay, so what's the next steps here? You know, they don't know the nature or the frequency, how many questions they're going to get, how many comments they're going to receive. So they're not going to be able to give me a real direct answer, but they may say, okay, we think this process will take another 6 months to finalize. Then at that time, we would expect to re-engage with West Sacramento on a revised map. So once I get more information, I'll bring that back to the board. But the urgency of everything we're doing is not only just to reduce risk as quickly as possible, but then there's the FEMA remapping element that's closely tied to our program and the urgency of getting these improvements in the ground. So we'll keep you apprised of that. Yesterday, we had a very positive meeting with Congresswoman Matsui at her request. She asked us to come in, give her a briefing about our program. Mayor Cabalden, Bill Panos, and I, and Rick Reinhart attended that meeting. It was very positive. She's very well informed about all the aspects that we're going through. You know, she's been with SAFCA now for representing them for 8-9 years, so she's very well versed in the language that we're talking and all the issues that we have to overcome to get projects moved forward through the difficult process of the Army Corps. So she's very well engaged. She's looking forward to assisting us even before West Sacramento becomes into her district, because she understands the time is now on some of these items, most specifically the 104-221 issue. She informed us that she has regular dialogue with the Assistant Secretary of the Army on this issue, and now she's going to be representing West Sacramento. So we were very much encouraged by the conversation that we had yesterday. We're going to continue to work closely with her staff and herself, and I'm thinking this is going to be a very, very positive thing for the city of West Sacramento and our flood protection program. So just to quickly highlight some of the construction work that we completed in 2011. The CHP Academy, the Rivers EIP projects, those projects are completed. We're just, putting the bow on everything now. We're going to be working on the construction documentation report that we need to produce for those projects so that at the end of the day we can get those projects certified. The Army Corps they've winterized the Sac Bank project, and they will pick those activities up in the spring. And based on the weather that we've gotten lately, they'll probably be able to start right on April 15th, but we'll wait and see on that. But we're going to keep a very close eye on their progress. They need to finish that project this year. We did talk about that at PRB. So we're going to keep a very close eye on that project. The Corps did complete the Yolo Bypass slip repair project north of Highway 80, and they also completed that what we call an emergency slip south of the 2009 slip repair project that was completed. So they've finished those projects. The city of West Sacramento has seen about $25 million worth of construction improvements in 2011. It's substantial progress. So I'm happy to report that today. Okay, let me stop there and see if there's any questions on what I just talked about, the current projects that we just wrapped up and some of the meetings that we had, or if there's any questions there. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to launch into the Southport EIP project. So today's goal, what we want to present to the board today is Task Order 3, the findings that we have in Task Order 3, so you can get a real good understanding of those findings, the alternatives that we looked at, the combined measure alternatives, and get into some of the details there. And then we're going to show the two alternatives that were taken to the 15% design level to give us greater understanding of how we combine certain alternatives and what they actually look like on the ground, so that the board can have an idea of how we start assembling products and what they look like, so that the board can make decisions in the future on that. So as a reminder, we went through a lot of detail last month on the steps it takes to get through a process such as this project, how you have to analyze, you have to identify what the problems are in your system. You have to identify solutions to correct those problems. You look at all the different alternatives. Some are determined to be a feasible alternative. Yes, they will correct the problem. Others are determined not to be feasible. They don't correct the problem. We stop analyzing those alternatives. And then you start testing, you start putting together the different alternatives to build a project. And then you run those through the decision-making process. I wanted to remind everybody on the decision hierarchy and sequence matrix that has been put together, very detailed, gives the reader a good understanding of the steps it takes to run different alternatives through an analysis process so that decisions can be made on how to move forward. Some of the key items to talk about is feasibility. Does it work? Does it not work? What are the impacts of a feasible alternative on adjacent properties, the environment, the city as a whole? So we have to look at all of that. And then you got to look at what's the cost effectiveness of it. As I talked about earlier, there's an urgency that we need to move forward and get these improvements in the ground, not just because to reduce risk to life and property. There's also other factors. There's the FEMA remapping factor. There's also a factor that I didn't mention yet, but as I mentioned earlier, we got money from the state. We increased our design funding agreement by $14 million. There's only so much time that money is going to be made available to local agencies such as ours, and we're sort of in the lead right now. Other agencies are trying hard to catch up to us. When I was at PRB, there was a whole slew of flood control agencies going to PRB, meeting with the Corps, pressing their needs. So we're going to be competing for a very limited pot of dollars as we move forward. So we need to keep that in mind. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael Vecchio, who made a great presentation last month. He's going to walk through some of the details of where we're at to date. Just keep in mind, Task Order 3 is still preliminary findings. We're still pulling together the pieces in order to construct a project. So he's going to walk through that process right now.
President Denton, members of the board, I'm Michael Vecchio from HDR. I'd like to spend some time focusing on the first two and third steps of that decision-making hierarchy and kind of walk you through where we started with the third task order for the Southport project, how we evaluated the information in service of developing proposed preferred alternative at the 15% design level, and an alternate to that alternative. I have some handouts here that I'd like to distribute before we get into this too much further. I have one here. I know I have one, but I think our board members need some. So what was handed out are the three alternatives that we assembled for examination and presented to the board in May. And these were what we've been studying to examine technical feasibility of the different corrective measures. So the first thing I want to do is go over those and then talk about how those evaluations inform the process of assembling what we took to 15% design. So you have a picture of these, and we'll go over them in more detail. But in general, we looked at three basic approaches. The first one said, let's examine an adjacent levee from the top of the project to the bottom, combined with the underseepage measures that we thought to be technically feasible at that time, hence the name Combined Measure Alternative. So CMA 1 is an adjacent levee with the underseepage measures that are indicated on the slide. CMA 2 is a setback levee with the same underseepage measures, and CMA 3 is a strengthened in place. Okay, so you have your own copies. I know that's not that legible, but there's a few key points I wanted to make about what you see, particularly as regards the width of the seepage berms. At that time, we did not have good underseepage information, so we assumed a conservative footprint. So the yellow band that you see there is the initial width of the seepage berms, which was set at 400 feet. Now, even at that time, we anticipated that through geotechnical evaluations, we could justify installing seepage berms of a more narrow width. At that time, we didn't have that information yet. So one of the important things we did throughout the summer was try to develop, based on our geotechnical engineering investigations and the modeling, was there a way to justify making those seepage berms thinner than 400 feet? That was an important question we had to address. We got to that point, and a little bit later in the presentation, I'll report on what those widths turned out to be. CMA 2, it mentions there in the title a 400-foot setback. I should clarify that that distance is measured from the land side of the existing levee to the land side toe of the setback levee. So that's not really the offset area. The offset area itself is about 250 feet. It's called a 400-foot setback based on the dimension that I just described. So the exhibit shows at a conceptual level anyway the footprint associated with that particular alternative. The seepage berms, again, were assumed conservatively to be at a 400-foot width. And again, as explained a few minutes ago, we were able to justify narrowing those down through a series of evaluations. If you look at CMA 3, strengthened in place, I should have highlighted more information about the legend, but on the left, you basically have a series of line and color codes that allow you to look up and down the alignment and to deduce what combination of measures were proposed for a given segment. So, for example, in segment A for CMA 3, you have that dashed green line, slope flattening with a cutoff wall. Even at that time, we had some evidence that a cutoff wall might be feasible in A. And one of the things that we wanted to do, in addition to refining the width of seepage berms during the third task order, was to confirm what depths we thought we would have to install a cutoff wall to. So that was another important step associated with the third task order. So I'd like to walk down the alignment, and using these three proposed alternatives or study alternatives, this is the question we really wanted to get at. Were the corrective measures that we think are feasible there, are they? And if so, are there important modifications like the width of a berm or the depth of a wall or the possibility of a wall? How good were our assumptions? And so the slides that follow report on our findings of technical feasibility on a segment-to-segment basis. And the purpose of walking through that exercise is when we get to the end of it, that essentially shows us what the menu of options are from which alternatives can be assembled to take to the 15%. So we've taken 2 to the 15%. We're kind of walking through the process of how did we find out what we could combine in service of a proposed alternative and an alternate. So all of these slides are formatted the same, but let me just say a few things about it. So we've got, for each segment, we have a listing of typical deficiencies that we suspect are there or that are documented to be there. Those are listed in bold on the left. Then in italics, we've listed out the typical corrective measures that are used to correct for those deficiencies. If there's a check next to the corrective measure, that means our evaluation showed that that particular measure would be feasible to put on the ground from an engineering point of view. Okay. So we've got underseepage, erosion, geometry, and stability. All of those measures that are listed to correct those deficiencies, with the exception of relief wells, at this level of study, are considered to be technically feasible. A reminder that the answer on whether or not it's technically feasible or not is heavily dependent on the local subsurface conditions. So if they're the same from one segment to another, you're going to see a slide that says the same things are feasible from one segment to another. If the subsurface conditions vary, the technical feasibility can change. So for segment B, for underseepage, the seepage berm is still technically feasible. Relief wells are not. The coding there for cutoff wall indicates that our findings are that for a portion of segment B, a cutoff wall is technically feasible, and for another portion of it, it's not. And you'll see a little bit later in our proposal exactly what interval of that segment we determined to be technically feasible. The other measures that are listed there for correcting erosion deficiencies, geometry, or stability were all determined to be feasible. Segment C, around Oak Knoll Bend, there we lose the bottom, so to speak, or the layer that we would tie a cutoff wall into. We actually lose it a little south of there in B, and then those geological conditions translate up into segment C. So we have a seepage berm as our only option at this point in segment C for mitigating or correcting for underseepage. The other measures for erosion, geometry, and stability were still determined to be technically feasible. Okay, for segment D, similar results. Everything was determined to be technically feasible for the noted deficiencies, with the exception of relief wells. Segment E, we have a similar situation in E as to segment B with regard to underseepage mitigation. Relief wells were determined not to be feasible. A portion of E, there's a layer within reach to tie a cutoff wall into, and for another portion there's not. Segment F, similar to segment C, so F's north of G. Relief wells are not feasible, cutoff walls are not, a seepage berm is. The other measures listed below for erosion, geometry, and stability are. And segment G, the only measure that we found to be not technically feasible were relief wells. So taken together, every place we had a check gave us a menu to sit back and say, now that we're going to assemble what we're going to call a proposed alternative and what we're going to call an alternate, it has to be one of the correct, it has to include measures that we have a check by. Okay, so later you'll see the combination of those measures in service of a proposed preferred alternative and an alternate. This was just to take us through the process. One other important thing we did that plays into the decision-making about what those alternatives look like was to develop project cost for the three combined measure alternatives that we just went over. What I've listed up here are the different cost components: property acquisition, structure demolition or relocation, utility relocation, environmental mitigation, the levee improvements themselves. These are the seepage berm and the cutoff wall, the adjacent levee, and so on. Planning, engineering, and design, and then construction management. So we've developed draft cost opinions for these three. We've submitted them to our internal team for review. Some questions have been raised about assumptions that fed into those cost opinions. We're currently revisiting those assumptions. One of the areas that we're looking at very closely is how we're estimating the required cost for controlling erosion. Unlike under seepage and some of the other deficiencies, the criteria for controlling erosion can vary, and the associated cost can. So we're looking through different options for developing a basis of design for controlling erosion and trying to assign the correct cost. And when that process is completed, we'll be presenting that information to the board related to these three CMAs. So,
partial levee degrade, does that mean you're going to take vegetation off and then sort of lower the levee or widen the levee, different slope? What's that mean?
A partial levee degrade does have to do with excavating a portion of the existing levee. Depending on how much we've excavated, there could be removal of vegetation on the water side. It would be done in conjunction with the implementation of a setback levee.
And so that would then trigger and require a riprap.
For a setback levee option, we know that we need to be able to maintain the riverbank in place. It won't necessarily require installation of riprap. We might be able to use softer measures where we use planting to hold the riverbank in place, or a combination of planting and some amount of riprap. But that's one of the cost factors we're looking closely at, because we don't think that under that scenario that you would treat it, for example, the way you would treat segment A now, where there's just riprap, up and down the side slope. We think we might be able to get by with a softer measure. So. Okay. I will be back in a bit to walk through the proposed alternative and the alternate, but I wanted to entertain any other questions just about the process that got us to this point.
Well, I guess one of the questions that I have is as we go through this is 15% design, and what happens when we get to 60? Could there be an alternative D? As we're doing 1 and 2, we're also going to do 3, and that'll bring in at a later date. And I guess the question I have is, as we go from 15%, which is a pretty small percentage as far as design is concerned, if it is found that there are other fixes that may assist either homeowners or may assist a better fix or whatever it is, and we go ahead to make that, can we make that change in a timely manner?
The changes we would anticipate going from 15 to 60 would involve small degrees of change rather than a wholesale change in the corrective measure. So, for example, if right now there's a setback levee that's proposed in a location, or let me take something like a seepage berm that's easier to discuss. If right now we think it's 250 feet wide, going from 15 to 60 could change that to 270 feet or to 230 feet, depending on additional investigations in that area that the berm would be placed. But right now, we have a design level of geotechnical investigation, like the minimum required based on the Corps of Engineers geotechnical investigation criteria. So we think we have enough information right now to determine whether or not a measure would work at each location. So we're not anticipating a wholesale change in a measure, for example, from a berm to a cutoff wall. We are anticipating potential degrees of change associated with one measure.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Okay. Michael Bissett is going to pick up our process where this is kind of the end of our technical feasibility, at least to this point in the design phase. He's going to talk about the subsequent steps in the decision-making hierarchy, minimizing impact, maximizing benefits, and then I'll return to actually talk in detail about the proposed alternative and the alternate.
So, Bill, the very nature of your question is the details of how we're going to walk through this process, okay. and we'll hit upon that. So, Michael just presented the CMA analysis. If you could go to the next slide, please. So, we were hoping to present those cost opinions for those 3 CMAs, but as Michael identified, they're under the review process. We're burning them. Our staff is burning the midnight oil on reviewing those. We've come up with, some questions, as Michael identified, most specifically to erosion and how we mitigate for erosion, the amount of riprap that we're going to need to place on the existing levee, and at what locations. So, because those costs can really skew the cost for that type of alternative, we had to hold back. So we didn't want to put those cost estimates out today, knowing they're going to potentially drastically change in the future, and we're hoping they change for the better. We're hoping to pull back those costs. We're hoping to minimize the amount of riprap that was anticipated at this juncture in the process. So those costs will be coming to you next month. What we wanted to highlight today is based on costs, that's how we're going to start factoring in when we negotiate with DWR. What type of project are we going to move forward with? How does it figure into their guidelines of cost sharing? We've identified CMAs 1 and 3, the adjacent and the fix in place will have a certain range of a cost share percentage, and CMA 2, a setback levy, has a higher cost share percentage, and we have certain ranges identified now. Once we start cobbling together these CMAs to actually define a project, and you'll see what we've done to a 15% level that Michael's going to present today. Once you start cobbling and assembling the different components and making a project out of it, these cost share percentages will get better identified, and most likely they're going to fall within these ranges. And Derek Larson with MBK Engineers is going to work hard to try to get it above those ranges, as he did for us on the North projects. And we always try to identify that for Derek to work hard to get those. And he's been doing a wonderful job with DWR and has established a very good relationship working with them within their guidelines. So it's been a great process. So next slide, please. So how do we continue to move forward? What are the steps that we take? Earlier in the presentation, I identified the decision-making matrix. That is what we continuously go back to. It's like the gauntlet. We run each of the alternatives through that gauntlet to determine what are the best methods to move forward. With the goals, as indicated on the slide, we need to construct as much flood protection as possible. We need to maximize this project, and if we can, build the entire 6 miles of the project. That's our goal. Goal 2, we need to minimize to the extent feasible, the impacts on adjacent properties and the community as a whole. So it's a delicate balancing act, and we're going to continue to refine the way we do our business, and we present information to this board so that we can all collectively make the best decisions possible for the entire community. So that's the process that we're running through. Where we're at right now, HDR has done a wonderful job of looking at all the remediation measures and determining whether they're feasible or not feasible with the level of information that we have currently. And we're going to continue to get more information, and I'm going to walk you through that process. Next slide, please. So CMAs 1, 2, and 3, what Michael presented, those are the outer range of feasible options. So an adjacent levee, we took that through the entire 6 miles. What does that look like? A setback levee, the same thing. The entire 6 miles, what does it look like in a fix in place? So that we can understand what's feasible, what's not feasible with all the measures that you add onto that type of improvement. Now we're going to start moving into a greater level of detail as we move from 15s to ultimately through 100%, with the goal to work very closely with the community to minimize impacts and to build as much as project as we can. So those are the overarching goals. We're going to continuously look at how we're planning to move forward and continuously run those potential projects through that decision-making process as we move forward. Next slide, please. So Michael's going to get up and present how we as a staff have compiled the CMAs. We've pulled together the best possible methods within the different reaches, and we've produced 2 alternatives that we needed to take to a 15% level so that we could start laying some footprints on the ground and start identifying impacts, potential impacts of what those projects would have on the community. So Michael's going to walk through those to the board. How we went about doing this is, from a staff level, we assembled the best components for the various reaches. We've sat down with our steering committee, Ken, Bill Panos, and Toby Ross, our city manager. We've looked at what's feasible, what's not feasible within the certain reaches, and we started putting together components and creating projects. So one has what we're calling at this level, it's this, we didn't put staff, but it's the preferred alternative. This is the alternative that, based on today's level of detail, minimizes the footprint and minimizes the impacts to the adjacent properties. The other alternative is a longer setback levee. It's, I think, half a mile or more of setback levee versus the preferred alternative. So to give us an understanding of what does that look like. And then as soon as now we're going to start pinning down costs so we can understand the cost of 1 versus 2 and the cost share with the state of 1 versus 2. So we're starting to get much more detail as we move forward so that the board and the community can understand the magnitude of the cost, the magnitude of the impacts, the magnitude of the cost share with the state, and how we want to move forward. So I'm going to let Michael walk through the 2 15% designs, and then I'll come back in and try to wrap things up.
Mike, will there be a CMA4?
No. We've gotten the 3 CMAs. We had it's funny, the language that we've been using is we understand is confusing to people. It's sometimes confusing to us because, you know, trying to identify, put a label on an alternative is a creative art, and we're engineers, and maybe we don't have that art instilled within us. But what we're looking at doing is having these. We think these 2 alternatives at the 15% design level are the best alternatives from a feasibility standpoint on how to move forward. And what you had asked, Bill, is, in the future, can these change? And the answer is yes, and we definitely think they're going to change, because even at this stage of detail, we've laid out footprints on the ground, and as we continuously move forward and gather more information, we're hoping to minimize those footprints where we can. That's the process we're going to move forward on. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, it does, but I mean, I guess I would look for a little more certainty if I was sitting in another place. But I mean, I just want to make sure that we are going to make sure we have some flexibility, make sure we take into consideration, you know, all of the different issues that are surfacing and this and that. And if we can save a house, that's what we'll do. And as we move down the whatever it is, as we move towards the finalization of a project and finalization of a design.
Right.
I just want to make sure that those options are still open to the board, so that, you know, we can best serve, you know, all the constituents of the city of West Sacramento.
Yep.
So,
absolutely.
okay, all right.
Okay, Michael?
Okay, you should have received two different packets. The one that we're going to start with says proposed preferred alternative in that title block. The two alternatives do not differ quite a bit, so make sure that you're looking at the right one. It's the title block's over on the left-hand side. Let me say a few introductory words, and then the exhibits that follow the paneling exhibit, which is this first one we're looking at, show an enlarged view of each of the 7 segments. So this first sheet was not intended to be legible other than just to show you where segment A is and where segment B is and so on. But let me mention a few general features of this particular alternative. It's about 5.5 miles long. About 2.8 miles of it would be setback levee. Wherever we feel like cutoff walls are technically feasible, which is a little over 2 miles of that 5.5 miles, they're proposed for this alternative. That includes about 800 feet of a deep mixed wall, or what you'll hear referred to as a DSM wall, which requires our special technology. It's considerably more expensive than our conventional walls. Those are the ones that are installed at depths that exceed about 85 feet. So that 2.2 miles of cutoff wall includes about 800 feet of where we think a deeper wall is feasible. If you go to the second sheet, this is segment A. That's about 0.8 miles long. For the proposed preferred alternative, it's a strengthened in place. With the cutoff wall, you'll see a bright red line running down essentially the existing center line of the levee. That represents the cutoff wall. You can see how it extends into the southern end of segment B. That's the portion of B where our investigations indicate that installing a cutoff wall is feasible. Just to direct your attention to a little more detail about the exhibits, if you look down at the legend, there's an explanation of each of the color codes. So, for example, the kind of the light orange color is slope flattening. The bright red line, as I said, is a cutoff wall. I think one thing that was left off of the exhibit, but is clearly delineated, that heavy black dashed line is a good approximation of the extent of the footprint of the levee. So that includes the levee improvement itself. It includes South River Road. It includes a utility corridor. And all of those components are a part of the project footprint, and they're all encircled by that heavy dashed black line. If you go to segment B, it's about 1 mile long. Where it's technically feasible, we're proposing installation of a cutoff wall down towards the southern end of that segment. For most of the segment, however, we're proposing an adjacent levee with a seepage berm. The X's on structures indicate that they would either be demolished or relocated under this proposed alternative. On the landward extent of the seepage berm, which appears in pink, there's a relocated South River Road in yellow, and then landward of that, about a 30-foot wide utility corridor. You go to segment C around Oak Knoll Bend. It's about 1 mile long, and it would all be set back. The setback would vary. The actual offset area between the levee and the river's edge at low flow would vary between about 250 and 1,100 feet when you get to the historical point bar shown at the bottom of the page. One thing I would point out is that the Department of Water Resources, their urban levee design criteria. They request that agencies, wherever possible, secure an operation and maintenance corridor up to 50 feet of width. We've shown that in this option because it could be done with relatively little impact on the land side to existing residents and other structures. In some places, you'll see that yellow band gets skinnier, and we go down to what we think is a tolerable minimum of about 20 feet. You go to segment D. It's a short segment. It's only about 4/10 of a mile long. We're proposing installation of a cutoff wall throughout that segment to correct for underseepage, as well as setting the levee back as shown. You can see the relocated South River Road. We've actually overlain the relocated South River Road on the Village Parkway, or the proposed Village Parkway alignment. So there's some overlap that we incorporated into the design to reflect future transportation planning in the area.
Hey, Michael, can you talk about how you overlap one element versus another, cutoff wall and seepage berm? Can you, since this is a real good indicator on this slide?
Sure. So what Mike's referring to, if you look at the left-hand side of segment D, you'll notice that the heavy red line, or the cutoff wall, extends right up to the boundary of segments C and D. And then you'll notice that the seepage berm that's coming out of segment C and into D, that it extends beyond that cutoff wall. That's an area where you're basically combining two different underseepage corrective measures. This becomes an important focus of further evaluation as we finalize design. The idea is that you want the combination of the cutoff wall and the seepage berm to function as a single unit. We've assumed in this case about a 200-foot overlap of the seepage berm and the cutoff wall. How much of that overlap there has to be is subject to a more advanced geotechnical evaluation that requires a three-dimensional analysis to see if it needs to be overlapped more or less. One thing I would point out is that one of the key findings from the ASCE committee that studied what happened in Katrina was that in many cases the transition location between one corrective measure and another one is a weak link in the system. And in our case, we have transitions like this from cutoff wall to seepage berm. We've assumed a fairly significant overlap, but it's subject to refinement as a part of further evaluations. Segment E, it's a good example. It's similar to B in that for a portion of it, we feel like we can install a cutoff wall, and for a portion we think we can't because we can't find the bottom to tie it into. It's about 6/10 of a mile long. About half of that is cutoff wall and half of it is seepage berm. Go to segment F. Segment F is an adjacent levee with a seepage berm. Seepage berm's about 120 feet wide here. It's a good example of where our further evaluations showed that a 400-foot berm was too much, and that we could demonstrate with our seepage models that one of about 120 feet of width was adequate. Those are the sorts of refinements that fall into the category of minimizing impacts to adjacent landowners. As originally drawn, this berm would have been 280 feet wider, and that's because we didn't have any better information to exclude such a great width. Now we do. We're able to pull that berm back. Segment G at the far north end of the project. The very north end of F, we pick up what we call the finish layer. And so you'll see a cutoff wall pick up there, and then it runs all the way to the north end of segment G. And so we have an adjacent levee with a cutoff wall. I think what I'd like to do is to walk through the alternate. It's very similar. I'll highlight the differences, and then I can entertain questions after that. So the second handout, it's titled Proposed Alternate Alternative. The overall project length is about the same. The center line varies a little bit, so there's about a 1/10 of a mile difference. The main difference between the proposed preferred alternative and this alternate is that we've added in about an additional 1/2 mile of setback area. And we'll see in more detail where that occurs. So the first alternative, or the proposed preferred, has 2.8 miles of setback. This one has about 3.3. So, segment A for the alternate is identical to the preferred alternative. Segment B is where the main change occurs. The transition you see there from the powder blue to the purple, that's the transition from the adjacent levee with the berm to the setback levee with the berm. We basically pulled that transition further to the south. So this is the area in segment B where there's additional setback that's built into the alternative. So it's worth comparing and laying those two segment Bs side by side, and it becomes abundantly clear that installation of the seepage berm in service of correcting the under seepage is what's having a significant impact on adjacent landowners. Yes, sir.
That diagonal setback at the
actually, Tom, that's a very good question. Tom's question is about, if you look at the far right-hand side, you'll see the purple hatch coming down at a diagonal angle down to where the existing levee is. Because of the size of this job, Tom, and the amount of material that we'd have to get into place in one construction season, when we've developed the cost opinions and our emissions analyses and so on, we assumed that any alternative would be installed in 2 different phases. And so for the purposes of our design exercises, we assumed that segments C through G would be installed first, and that A and B would be installed second. So what you see there is the southern boundary of phase 1, because we'd have to tie a setback levee back into the existing levee, and we've just left it on here. And then the second phase of construction would actually improve the levee in A and B. Now, I mean, there's a couple of important caveats. It's hard to envision exactly how a project this size would be phased, and it could certainly be more than one construction season, but we had to make some assumptions in order to run out cost and get emissions numbers for our environmental impact statement and so on. If you look at segment C, it's the same as the proposed preferred alternative, a setback throughout with the seepage berm. Segments D and E are the same. When you get to segment F, I mentioned one spot where, in fact, I think I mistakenly said all of the setback was increased in B. In the proposed preferred alternative, we had an adjacent levee with the seepage berm in F. In this alternate, we've shown the levee is set back throughout all of F. Segment G is the same as the preferred. So I can provide more detail about either of these alternatives or answer any other questions that you might have, or I might have to ask some others to support with answers.
On the segment B, on the second handout that you have, is that basically the preferred alternate?
Sorry, Bill, could you repeat your question on segment B for the preferred alternative?
Yeah, on the second handout that you come up with. The lighter colored one with pink.
Right.
It appears that the first one, with the first handout, that it's almost twice as much land involved as the second one.
You mean total real estate purchase associated?
Yeah.
There would be more real estate purchase associated with the alternate than the preferred alternative. That's true.
Yeah, the preferred, sorry, Michael, but the preferred, right, at this stage in where we are today, is we're trying to minimize the impacts on adjacent property. So the preferred shows more adjacent levy versus setback levy. Now, what I was going to highlight in a couple of slides from here, but I might as well do it now, what these 15% designs don't show is the further refinement that we're going to take as we move forward to start combining, for example, in segment B, a shallow wall or what they call a hanging wall. We can't get it all the way down into a clay layer, but we can get it down far enough where maybe we can minimize, in combination with a seepage berm, minimize the footprint onto the adjacent property. So combining both the cutoff wall and a berm, what does that look like? Does that shrink the berm from what we're showing as 250 down to, say, 150? So we minimize that footprint. We need to continue with our analysis in order to determine whether that's feasible, and if so, what are the impacts? So that's coming up. We're not there yet. So I was going to bring that up, and that is a good time to highlight that fact.
That is part of the 15%.
That is not part of the 15. That's part of moving from 15 to 60. So we're not showing that right now. We're hoping these 15% are to the level of detail that we have. They're the greatest extent of the impacts on the property. We're hoping as we continue to move forward, we minimize those impacts.
Thank you, Michael.
Yep. So why don't we launch into the next slides? Let me just run through the presentation, then we can get questions at the end.
Okay.
So this is where we're at to date. So we combine the CMAs into 15% designs, 2 different alternatives. We're at a level of detail that our staff can continue on in the design process to further refine impacts and also to get the level of cost, of magnitude of cost of one alternative versus another, how those factor into the state's guidelines of cost sharing so that we can determine how much project we can build. So it's a step-by-step process as we move forward. Next month, like I said, we'll have those costs presented to the board. We'll be able to lay that out in much greater detail so that the board can understand, okay, if we choose this alternative, these are the relative costs that the project will have on the local agency and on the state, and here's the steps as we move forward to minimize impacts as we move forward. What we've made a commitment to do, and as this board has directed us to do, we're going to work very closely with all the property owners to educate them on the process, to work with them on trying to minimize the impacts. The segment B property owners have a geotechnical engineer engaged, and we're gonna bring him into our process so he understands what we're doing. The Liberty Development Group has a geotechnical engineer. We met with them yesterday. We're going to continue to meet with them to further define or refine the projects on their property. and so on as we move up the alignment, because we're working with everybody who's impacted on this project and who wants to be more educated on the project. So next month, we're going to take task order 4 to this board for approval. And here's the components of what task order 4 is. We're going to complete the public draft and final environmental documentation in order to satisfy CEQA and NEPA. So we've taken it up to a certain point through task orders 1, 2, and 3. Now we need to continue and complete that process. So that's one element. The design process is another element. We're going to go from 15% of the 2 that we have. We're going to work together, and then the board will ultimately select a project for us to move forward on, and we'll take that project and move to a 60% level. What we'll bring to the board also is elements of decision-making points of the one 15% versus the second 15%. We can label them any way we want. We can take out the preferred or whatnot. We can cobble together pieces of both of those and make a project and move forward. But we want to be able to educate the board on what are the ramifications of doing that, the cost ramifications or implications. How does that factor into being able to achieve our goal and completing as much levee improvements as quickly as possible that we can afford? So we need more information to bring to the board to do that, and we're prepared to do that. Next slide, please. Other components of task order 4, I'm going to quickly run through these, is continuous hydraulics analysis. Next slide, please. Geotechnical is very critical in determining the footprints of the projects. We're going to start, like I mentioned earlier, combining different measures and see if in combination do they minimize the footprint and still achieve our goal in completing the project. So we got to keep in mind what the goal is. We want to build as much as we can, and then the second goal, minimize impact. So we need to continuously evaluate both of those goals. Next slide, please. Geomorphology. So we have a lot of technical experts that have done a lot of work to date. They need to continue to refine their work in order to minimize impacts, in order to identify costs, and at the end of the day, build a project that we can certify. Next slide. Groundwater evaluation. Next slide, please. Civil design. So this is combining everything together, pulling together now that we've gotten to a 15% level, this is another important point that needs to be made. Now we have a level of design where we as a staff can start working with all the affected utility companies. So there's a lot of utility relocations that are going to need to take place. We're going to start launching into greater level of detail on surveying that needs to take place. So these are the type of components as we move forward. We need to start incorporating these now that we have a better level of detail, and we'll continue to move this process forward. Next slide, please. So here's our milestones. I want to continuously remind the board and the public of what our milestones are as we move forward. On the 26th of this month, we're going to present this same detailed information to the public in a better format for them to ask questions, talk about their properties, pull aside the technical experts and ask their questions, and have their experts be there and ask questions also. So we have a public workshop set up on the 26th. Next month at this board meeting, we're going to, if we can pull all the parts together, I was hoping to present the TO3 cost opinions today. We weren't able to do that. We'll be able to do that next month, but we need to be able to present this board with enough information so that it's comfortable in giving us direction on how to move forward. So we're going to work very hard to get all our cost opinions together, how those impact one versus another design feature, the comparison, so that the board can make a decision on how best to move forward. And then we're going to bring task order 4 for approval to the board next month. Now, the board can, and what we're hoping is we at least get task order 4 approved so that we can continue with a lot of the work that we're doing right now. If we're not ready, if the board isn't ready to make a selection on a preferred alternative, we can push that to the next board meeting if as a staff we haven't given you enough information in order to make that decision. But we're going to work very hard to be able to prep the board and be very comfortable in giving direction to move forward. That's the goal for next month. In March, we're still working on the CHP and Rivers tree restoration work, so we'll be taking a contract to award in March. Late summer, early fall, depending on when the board allows or determines a preferred alternative and gives us direction to move forward. We're anticipating being at the 60% level of completion in late summer, early fall, September, October, November timeframe. It's at that level of detail where we'll have those footprints, identified what the real estate implications are for the preferred project, and we'll be able to start the appraisal process from a real estate perspective. So that's only at that time, so that would be late summer, early fall. Another reason to try to continue this process and move this process forward in an expedited manner, not only for the state funding that I mentioned earlier, but we're hearing from a lot of property owners the uncertainty is very disturbing to them. They want to know one way or the other, okay, how's this project going to impact my property? And they want that certainty, whether it's their house is going to be okay, but the levee's going to come right up to it or whatnot, or the house is going to need to be relocated. They want to know. So the better we can do our job moving this project forward, not in a manner that's out of control, but in a very controlled manner, but as quickly as we can, I think the better off as a community will be. So that's our goal. Next slide, please. We're hoping to complete the environmental documentation process early 2013. That would allow for formal real estate acquisitions to occur. You have to have CEQA adopted before this board can purchase property, the agency. So that's the goal there. And all this time we're going to be working with the Department of Water Resources and the Army Corps and all the regulatory agencies on all the approvals we're going to need for this project. And we're hoping that they start landing and we get everything we need in hand by mid-2013 in order to move this project forward. Next slide, please. As a reminder, public outreach opportunities are many. The board meetings get information at the board. We're holding public workshops. Our next one's on the 26th. Myself, my team, we're always available to meet with the public in one-on-one meetings, and we've been having those meetings. I think they've been very successful to communicate information and for us to get feedback from property owners and their technical experts. So we look forward to that process moving forward. I think giving out all the information we can and sitting down and being very transparent in this process is going to go a long way for the public and the board to make everybody comfortable that we're moving forward in the best possible manner for the community as a whole. Next slide, please. And that concludes today's presentation. I know it's a lot of information, and we need you to digest that information. But we're ready to get any questions you have, or I don't know if there's any questions from the public or whatnot.
Well, one thing was brought up was the Liberty. You mentioned the Liberty people.
Liberty Development, yes.
When did they enter into this discussion?
They own the property around the Bees Lakes area, and this project being a setback levee at Bees Lakes has an impact to that proposed development.
This is the first I've heard of it. That's the reason I was asking the question.
Well, we've actually been working for a long time with their engineers, and it's been a long time since I've updated the board on this, and I can understand why you've forgotten. But their engineer had produced some geotechnical borings and analysis that we've incorporated into our process, and we've taken it further from where they ended, and we've continued on. And we're going to loop back in with their geotechnical engineers to start sharing our current findings and move forward with them.
Pardon? They changed their name. He just told me what it was. You have any questions? No. Tom?
I have a couple. Mike, or maybe the other Mike, on segment B in the preferred alternative, you do show a stretch of cutoff wall in the southern portion there. Are we saying that north of that, that cutoff alternative by itself is not feasible?
Michael, can you get up to the podium?
The answer is yes. That we are saying that it's not technically feasible there. It's based on the presence of a compacted gravel cobble layer in that area north or just beyond where the cutoff wall stops. But that's the basis of stopping there. There's a distance so there's an obstructing layer for a certain distance that's above a low permeability layer. So one piece is in place. In other words, there is one down there, 110 feet. The problem is the obstruction of the compact gravel layer that's above that. And then when you get a little further, it's actually to the east because of the orientation of B, but it's going upstream. As you go further, then the low permeability layer becomes too deep and we haven't been able to find it. So there's two different factors that are playing into the in not being technically feasible. First, there's an obstructing layer, then layer we can't even see the bottom.
So the idea there is to explore a combination of possibly cutoff wall and to reduce the footprint of the berm in some areas?
That is one of the design options that we're looking at investigating, which would be a partially penetrating wall in combination with the seepage berm.
Okay.
So that is one of the options we're looking at evaluating further going forward.
Okay. Okay. And then the other question to you, Michael, you talked about studying costs, how it relates to our participation, the state participation. And I understand this is an EIP project, and that's where the fundings come. Are we looking at all at what our final local share might be once there is federal participation?
We're always keeping our mind on the big picture, on where this factors in. You know, our strategy has been to use local dollars in combination with the state monies that's available to build these improvements as quickly as possible, with the end goal of having the Army Corps come in after and completing the entire project, but trying to quickly get levee improvements in the ground as quickly as possible. So that's the goal. So does this factor into the whole program? Yes. The whole issue we have, as I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, is the federal crediting issue.
Right.
That could become an issue to slow down our program, potentially. But, you know, we're doing everything we can to change the way 221 guidelines are interpreted currently so that our project will qualify for federal credit. And does that answer your question?
Well, it answers my question. I understand that, you know, now and the funds that will be available to do this project in an early implementation mode is state and local money.
Right.
But ultimately, if there is a reimbursement from the feds, our percentage on this project, how does it, you know, ultimately affect what our final cost, local cost will be based on that? And does the fact that we have to pay a higher percentage for one alternative to another now is important as far as how much money we have available to do, but ultimately, would we be reimbursed a good portion of that from federal funds?
Yeah.
Does that make any sense there?
It makes a lot of sense, and that's a key component as we move past the projects with the state, and then we start getting into the federal process. They're going to evaluate these projects and determine, okay, from a federal perspective, was that the project we would have built? And if not, if they deem there was a cheaper version, they would credit us for that cheaper project, and we could potentially be out some monies. And we would have to come up with additional monies in the future to come up with our local share. But ideally, as we run through, these projects have to run through the 408 process. We have to run through the state's process of a no regrets process in terms of, they don't want to invest state dollars in projects that they think there's a cheaper alternative also.
Because they could be subject to that same.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, we all partner into that same process. So the state is hoping to put their money into our program as quickly as possible to reduce risk, build improvements as quickly as possible. But they want all that money to be creditable towards the entire program cost also. Ultimately, as we've always said, if our program's a $500 million program, the feds are going to hopefully pay about 60 to 65% of that total. The state around 25, and the locals around 10. And those numbers are gonna fluctuate a little bit, but we're hoping they don't fluctuate on our side on the higher. And we're gonna work very hard to ensure that they try to stay within our means to afford this program.
Where do we stand? What's the thought on the 408 program is being changed back to the way it was?
I may ask Rick Reinhardt to address that. It's a very complicated issue on the 408 process. We haven't formally initiated that process just yet on this project. We will be doing that in the future. You really need, I think you're at the 60% plan level to formally initiate that. But Rick, you want to add something on the 408?
I do. Rick Reinhardt with MBK Engineers. The 408 process has continued to evolve with time. What we're really facing here over the course of the last year was the Corps' change in crediting process, where they moved from the 104 process to the 221. And that's where we're really trying to get some movement away from the strict requirements of 221 to something more flexible along the lines of 104. And that's what Michael was saying is the key impediment right now to implementation of this project.
Thank you. Michael, one other question. Maybe you can answer this. Tom, I'm sure you could answer it. What is the FEMA insurance rate in Thomas?
I can't tell you exactly, but it's gone up and down the last few years. But if without special reduction by FEMA, it's about $1,300 a homeowner. But they've had some reductions that have been, managed to get around $300 or $400.
I think that type of information we should maybe try to get out to the general public so that they understand that their present-day insurance is around $350 on FEMA flood insurance, but it could go higher than that if we don't get this accomplished.
I think that's a very good point, Bill. In terms of the FEMA impact on our program and on the city, we think we have a good chance if we were to build this entire Southport project, the entire 6 miles. We think we have a very good chance to qualify for an AR or an A99 flood zone designation, and that would give us our residents would have to pay flood insurance, but it wouldn't impede any types of new development or an existing homeowner who wants to add on to their home or do something like that. They would be able to do that. If we get a more unfavorable mapping, flood insurance is there, but then homeowners will not be able to build and really do much improvements to their property. They'll be designated within the floodplain, and they'll be subject to those guidelines as we move forward. So it's sort of a race against time in terms of getting as much flood protection improvements in place. I think first and foremost is to protect lives and property. Secondly is the FEMA implications.
Any questions?
I do. Mike, on segment B, it says you got a lot of little X's. And one of the things that would be helpful in the future is if you could identify what those X's are. I mean, I realize some of them are probably utility poles, utility this, or outside buildings or whatever else, but some of them are also probably homes. Mm-hmm. And so if you could identify which one is a home or which one is a, utility, not a major structure. I think majority of people are here this afternoon. Yep, this afternoon, because they're concerned about their homes, their properties. And so if we could, if you could just put some kind of notation there, that would be good. And one of the other things I'd like to have a look at, and that is if you go sort of north on segment B map, there's one cluster of a whole bunch of X's. And if some additional work could be done there, and if there's some other fix that may help that whole section, there may be, because that's not, everything is all clumped together. And so if there's a way to do something there to affect that, depending on what those X's are, I mean, there may be a telephone line. I have no idea. But at the same time, if there are a whole cluster of homes that are there, if something could be done just to look at that and say, well, maybe we could put in, something else. I would appreciate that.
Yep, no, that's a good point. The X's are on structures.
Yeah.
It doesn't identify whether it's a residence or an outhouse or something
Right.
like that, so
Right.
we can go ahead and put that definition in there.
Okay, that'd help me.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ed, do you have anything? Any more questions up here? No more questions from the board, so we'll go to the public request for, and I have one here from Karen.
Thank you, Chairman Denton, and I want to express appreciation for the thoughtful comments that you made, Mr. Kristoff and Mr. Ramos as well, and all of the thought you give to what's happening here. Our specific request on behalf of some of the Reach B landowners is that staff work intensively during this next month with our geotechnical engineer, Mr. Mark Gilbert of NGO, who's known and respected to the board, to see if it is possible to answer the question Mr. Ramos posed just a little differently, which is there a combination, a way to extend the cutoff wall for at least a further segment north of Reach B at that location? Because as Mr. Kristoff surmises, those X's that you see are mostly homes, and they can't all be relocated. They're going to be gone. And so we would make that request to you, and staff is already starting to work with Mr. Gilbert. But given the timing that has been presented this morning, we would really ask that we have every cooperation and every energy go into making as much an effort as possible to see if there's another combination of measures which can save some of these homes. And that's our request today. And then, because I'm a lawyer, I have to say this, and this is a very complex project. So you've got what it is that the state asks of you, you've got what the federal government asks of you, you've got to balance your responsibility to the citizens generally, to the people who have homes and property that are affected. So it's a real challenging process. But not mentioned this morning among the constraints that you have are California eminent domain law. And I did make a brief quotation, give you a brief quotation, but what the law demands is you must consider and balance the public good and try and provide it in a way that provides the least private injury. And that's a test, one of the tests that you have to meet when you decide to go ahead and use eminent domain, which you're going to have to do in order to complete this project. So we'd ask for that reason also that you would have the staff work just as much and just as hard with HDR and NGO to see if there isn't possibly another and possibly better solution. And then you're all technical people, so I'm going to say something that you all know, but it's probably worth saying at this time, is that when you create these reaches, they're because they have similar geotechnical characteristics. But they're not identical from one end of reach B to the other end. It's not identical. The same is true of A and E and C and D. And so there is the possibility of finding that a particular portion of a reach is different. And I think that was in an earlier question to staff, that was exactly the point that was made. So thank you for your courtesy, and we hope that you could give that direction and we appreciate the time you're under, which means now is the time to work really hard.
Thank you very much. That's all the questions that we have. There'll be nothing further with the board. Meeting's adjourned.